All right. Well, I'm Dave, and I've been doing After Effects for a long time, like 16 years or something. And today I'm going to show you After Effects. I've actually been really excited to do this. But first, how many of you have experience in After Effects? One year of experience. So 1 year or less. 1 year or less. Everybody? Okay. How many? Like 2 years. 2 years. 2 to 5 years. 2 to 5 years. And how many like After Effects veterans of 6 years or more? Everybody? All right. Well, Adobe After Effects is one of the most powerful, one of the industry standards for motion graphics and visual effects. And it is a Swiss Army knife, so it can do a lot of really cool things. And today, we're going to just dive right into a real-world project, something that I got the privilege to work on. And we're going to talk about some of my thought process in approaching a project from start to finish. Okay, so let me pull up the first project file here. So I work for the National Bible Bee. It's a organization that teaches kids how to memorize and study God's Word. It is a nonprofit organization, and they've been going for I think 16 years or so. And every year we will produce a series of graphic packages for them. So they release a theme every year, which is basically like gets everybody excited for what they're going to be studying. And this particular year it was Witness. And so I have to come up with an intro basically that kind of showcases just visually an exciting title reveal. That's basically what I'm doing here. So that was the project. This is going to be about 30 seconds. And so what I did was I actually just started with the asset that I was given. I was given this great piece of artwork that was done by an artist named Jen Reed, I believe. And so I was given this logo design, and pull it up right here. Here it is. So this was gonna go on the cover of their called a summer study notebook, basically. And this is what was designed for the year. So when I saw this, I got pretty excited because of all you can see this is like this tapestry situation. It's a flame. We've got, we do have the Witness logo, but basically this is what I start with. So I get this from the artist, and then it's up to me to figure out how am I going to create a interesting title reveal. So I start to think, start to brainstorm, and this gave me a lot of inspiration. So starting with really good assets, really good graphic design really helps. So that could be done by another artist, in this case it was, or it could be done by yourself. Maybe this is something that you've searched for reference and you've developed this art all by yourself. But then the second step is going to be, how do we reveal this with animation inside of After Effects, which does have limitations. After Effects is not really a dedicated 3D program. So if I want to do 3D-ish design, it's going to have some limitations. That said, you can do a lot in After Effects. So I'm going to show you, pull it up here. This reel is almost 100% After Effects. So rendered inside After Effects. You'll see some 3D stuff in here, but this is basically just After Effects. So you'll be able to see there is a lot of functionality, there's a lot of flexibility that After Effects does provide, and even though it does have its limitations, it also has its strengths. All right, so Adobe After Effects can do a lot of things, live action, motion design. What you saw in there was there were quite a few third-party plugins to achieve some of the 3D stuff. For example, I use a plugin called Element 3D from Video Copilot. It's very powerful, can do a lot. But in this particular case, my initial idea was to see some type of light happen where you get kind of this reveal where maybe the strokes are being revealed, but it's like light, maybe on a parchment or something like that. I remember seeing like an old Disney ad or something where there were these kind of lines that were sort of shooting across a page, and then it turned into the cartoon and all that stuff. So I'm thinking in that regard. So that was really the first step, was just basically brainstorming. And then I went ahead and started running some tests. So this has been really helpful, I've found, where you're able to kind of give yourself some time to do some R&D, research and development, to kind of figure out a feasible direction for your project. In this particular case, I was very curious what I could do with a particle generator. I used a particle generator called Particular from Red Giant, and it is pretty powerful, but I went and ran a test, and it looked like this. I'll show you. There we go. Okay, so basically I'm using a particle generator. I'm animating a camera in 3D space. It's really fast. There's not a whole lot, right? But I'm testing out this technique. I wonder if we could get the lights dimmed or turned down, maybe over here. So honestly, when I saw how this was looking, I was super impressed, because I was thinking, okay, this is not a 3D program. I'm not even using, CG fire. This is real fire footage that I'm replicating through a particle generator, okay? And it looks like it's pinned to the ground. Again, I can move around in 3D space. It's a very simple test. I got sparks flying. Some of them are bouncing on the ground. There's just this energy to it, and I was thinking, I can draw any shape with this effect. This is a replicatable procedural effect. And look at how, like, these sparks, the sparks are not real. Sparks are fake, but the fire is real footage. And this, even the sparks don't look half bad. You'll get some more imperfections if you use actual real footage, but this would do for what I was working with. So I went through the process of basically imagining what I could do. Then it was a matter of diving into a 30-second ad, basically. So part of the ad was going to be text on the screen, kind of like a movie trailer, this summer, kind of like that. And then the rest of it was going to be this logo reveal. And so I was going to progressively reveal this logo over time. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up. Okay. This is what I ended up with, and I want to make sure I've got sound on this. Could you, for that demo reel, could you hear sound, or was it just coming from the laptop? No, just the laptop? Okay. I wonder if this will work. Okay. Oop. All right. It matters not. So here's the final product. Okay. All right, so thank you. All right, so look, this fire's going through. I can move the camera, and it's just, in this particular case, I'm not revealing the logo. I'm just having the fire burn along the logo. These are some of those decisions that are made for time, really. Like, what can I do in this amount of time? Is it going to be too much to try to reveal this logo progressively? Or I just decided to have this fire, and that would be enough. Okay. One of my original ideas for this was like, I love this idea of these trailers where it starts kind of wide, and in this particular case, it's like that, I had that in my mind, right? And then it became a video, right? So I didn't have the entire logo in my mind, reveal in my mind, but I would have little bits and pieces like this, like I want the fire to be like spreading away. And really, that fire that's spreading like that, the piece of the logo that we're looking at is, I think, this top part here. So this is basically, I can have two streams of fire that are moving away. All right, so I'll hop over to my test comp. So I'm going to dive in and just start to show you how I put this together. Here's the effect. So I've got just a couple textures here. I got my floor texture. There we go. This is just pretty simple. By the way, it's a tileable texture, so I'm able to repeat it infinitely. There you have that. Okay, so that's going to be my floor. So I'm going to go ahead and rotate this. I'm going to make this -90 on the x-axis. I'm going to create a new camera. All right, and I'm going to create a null object. This is a controller in After Effects that I can use to control things like the camera. So I'm going to show you a basic camera rig. So this would be camera, position, okay? And this is just how I like to set up my camera rigs. I duplicate these nulls a couple times, and I'm going to make this rotation X. I'm going to go up, and I'm going to make this rotation Y. And I figured out that this particular setup allows me a lot of functionality and control over how my camera moves, okay? So what I just did was I parented the camera to the position null, I parented the position null to the X rotation null, and I positioned the X rotation null to the Y rotation null. And what this allows me to do is rotate an orbit around a center point of my scene, and this is the camera that's moving, but it's being controlled in this very customizable fashion. Can you see that texture? Is that coming through at all, or do we need to turn the light off? Turn what? Yeah, let's turn the lights back down so we can see. Okay, so we've got this going on. By the way, Y rotation is the same thing. I can move around. See, so what would happen if I didn't set it up this way? Y rotation and X rotation would start to kind of compete, and then I'd have to control for the different movements. This way I can have separate keyframes over my Y rotation, separate keyframes over my X rotation, and I can make a whole camera move. I'm going to just create one right now. I'll do the X rotation keyframe and Y rotation like that. Boom. I'm going to go forward. I'll go 6 seconds, and then I'm going to just rotate around like that, right? I'm going to actually shut off some of these layers. Okay, and then maybe I'm going down closer to the ground. Okay, so here's what we're looking at, right? It's a very easy camera move. It didn't take very long, and I've got all this control, because what would happen if I actually just want to move the position over? Well, I've got this controller now down here, if I want to move the camera over, it's still going to rotate around that center point. See where that other square is? So this gives me a lot of flexibility where I can modify the position of the camera in increments like this. And this is how I set up basically every starting camera rig for me looks like this. Okay, so I created a I always use okay, I don't know why that worked. So I created a camera. Okay, so I got my floor texture. Now let's create some particles. I'm going to create a new layer, and then I'm going to go, okay, particular. I'm going to double click on that, and what this gives me is this particle system, okay? This is just basically the default settings. So I'm going to always name your layers. I don't always name my layers, but I'm going to call this fire. Okay, Who has worked with particular or understands how it works? Okay, yeah, a little bit. This is a very powerful particle system. It's used quite widely with Adobe After Effects. So I'm going to scale up the size of these particles. So there's these particles coming out like that. And I'm going to do a couple of other things. I'm going to remove velocity. I'm going to remove some of these physics. And so now it's just a circle because it's just all these particles that are all coming on at the same time. And then I'm going to take another null object controller. And by the way, you can find this at layer null object. Okay, so there we go. And I'm going to name this N. And this is going to be fire particles. Okay, so I'm going to turn on 3D. So now this, I'm going to go to a custom view here so that I can freely move around without affecting the camera. So here it is, moving around. So my null object is in 3D space, just like my camera controllers are. So this is going to be the object that I draw a shape with, so the fire will follow. So I'm going to go to my top view. As you can see, the camera is looking, we're looking down on the camera, and the camera is facing parallel to the ground. So I'm going to take that null object that I just made, the fire particles, and I'm going to create a little animation with that. So I'll go ahead and move it out here, and then I'm going to set a keyframe. I'm going to move forward, again, about 6 seconds, and then let's see. I'll make an arc animation. So I'm going to pull out my Bezier handle, and I'm going to just kind of create an arc. Okay, so now this null object animates in an arc as the camera moves. Okay, so then I'm going to go back to my active camera, and I'm going to see how that looks. Okay, there goes the fire. Okay, and that actually might work pretty well. So now it's a matter of pinning the particle generator to that null object. So I'm going to go to my fire, and I'm going to option click on the position for XY. I'm going to pick whip this, the position of this controller, and this is just how particular in this particular version goes, but then I have to pick whip the X position separately. So now, if you see, we've got these particles that they are traveling along, go to the top view, they're traveling along this path. Okay, and now you see they're kind of ending up there because the lifespan of the particles is not very long. I'm going to actually go ahead and scale this back down, okay? And then I'm going to make these particles, instead of being these white scary dots, I'm going to make them into fire. So I have a fire loop animation that I worked up from a piece of footage, again from Video Copilot, and here's how that looks. It's basically a piece of fire, and I did some masking and stuff to create a loop so that the end frame is cohesive with the first frame. So this thing can loop forever, right? And this is what the fire looks like. I actually think this fire is in slow motion a little bit. Doesn't it look a little bit slow motion? So that gives me a lot of flexibility. So, if I have these particles birthing quickly, it won't really matter because the fire is just, drawing out pretty fast. But if I wanted to go slower motion, maybe I wanted a shorter, it to take longer for this fire to draw out, then I could have that flexibility because the fire footage is already kind of slow-mo. So I'm going to take my particle layer. I'll label that orange so that I can, label that orange. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead down to my particle emitter, and I'm going to take, let's see here, I'm going to make this from a sphere, I'm going to make this a sprite, and a sprite is a texture layer that always faces the camera. So no matter where I put the camera, these particles are always going to face directly at the camera. I'm going to make this my fire loop, layer 10 there. Now it says, oh, this is massive. You don't want to make particles with this, and yet I do. So let's see. Say OK. So you can see it's starting to draw out my particles with fire, which is great. Okay, it's really big, or really small, so I'm going to scale that up. And you'll notice it's referencing the footage at the exact same frame for every single particle because it's all just referencing this sort of real time. So you can see it says under texture here, current time. I want it to reference a random loop. So I want it to reference start at a random time in the fire footage for each and every particle. And what this gives me is now I'm starting to have fire that is, it all looks different, right? So a couple things I can do. I'm going to go to the size over life, and I'm going to select this, just a simple preset there. I can even kind of modify it. So what this gives me flexibility over is how the particles behave over their lifespan, so how they scale out near the end. And what I found was fire moves around so much that you have a lot of flexibility. You can kind of scale down fire without it looking like the layer is really just scaling down. But that's exactly what's happening. So I'm turning up the randomness of the life. I can make it a little bit more. Maybe I'll make it 4 seconds. Each particle lasts for roughly 4 seconds. And then I'm going to go down to the size random. I'm going to turn that up a little bit. Okay, so what do we got here? Let's play this. So now we've got this fire. It's moving along the ground. And I've got the flexibility to use a camera as well. Stop that right there so we can see it. Okay. Interesting. So at this point, I'm starting to see this as I'm working on it and say, okay, this is interesting. I'm starting to like what I see. I'm going to turn the mode to screen. So what this does is it blends all the fire footage together. And so what I can do now is I can actually reduce the amount of fire that is being replicated. So I get a little bit more of that individual detail, and it's not just like a white streak. Okay, so here's what that's looking like. It's getting closer and closer to that final product. Okay, so at this point, we need to deal with not only sparks, we do need to deal with some sparks, but we also really need to pay attention to lighting on the ground, because really these things don't just in the real world, this fire would be casting light on our ground. So we have our ground, which is great, and I've got a curves adjustment on that so that it darkens it. So what I need to do is I need to go ahead and create another layer of particles. So I'm going to duplicate the fire. I really want to duplicate the fire rather than starting over, because I already have all these settings in place. So I'm going to change the sprite from a sprite to a textured polygon. And the reason I'm doing this is because sprites always face the camera, but textured polygons, I can lay them flat on the ground. So first, I'm going to change the particle to this fire loop secondary. So this is one of those, I took basically that same piece of fire footage and then duplicated the layer a couple times, rotated it a few times, and then blurred it. And this kind of gives me something that I can lay down flat on the ground. So I'm going to go ahead and name this lighting, and I'll do lighting 1. Okay, so I'm going to change this particle to secondary. Okay, so here's the particle that's moving along. And by the way, I click this little circle, that just shows me that one layer so that I can work with it. And then I'm going to take the rotation, and I'm going to rotate it flat on the ground, 90 degrees. So now, if I go to my top view, you can see here are the particles, and they're flat on the ground. This is creating kind of the illusion of lighting. And everything I'm doing here is really all about illusion. It's about creating an effect, even if it's not actually casting light on the ground. I'm sort of trying to sell this, okay? So I'm going to turn this top fire footage to screen mode, and I'm going to take this floor texture and duplicate it, drag it right under that lighting layer, and I'm going to set this to an alpha matte. So this will take that fire and show the texture through that fire. Okay, so I'm going to scale up those particles a little bit like that, and I'm going to see how it all looks together. Well, nothing has changed because I can set this to screen, so you're starting to see some lighting there, and then I'm going to reset my curves adjustment and start tweaking how this lighting affects the ground. So I kind of want it to a little brighter like that, okay, a little bit more contrast, Okay, so let's see what's happening. So as you can see, there's starting to be kind of some lighting as this fire is going along the ground. Okay, so maybe I'll take this layer and add, I like to do this where I add a couple adjustments. I'll add a curves adjustment, go to the alpha setting and kind of crank that up just a little bit, and then I might even add a fast box blur. These are just some settings that really kind of help. So that particle, again, I'm impacting this particular layer, and then the texture is showing through that so that I have complete control over how it actually looks on the ground. So as you can see, I start to get more and more realism, and you can see the lighting's, going along. And so I basically just keep tweaking this. I keep adding layers. I add more lighting layers. I might add one that's a little closer in, that kind of that creates kind of a contact point. I might add one that's really bright. One of the ones that I liked to add was I added one that was pretty broad, but it was really crushed. The texture was really crushed, so it looked like there are pieces of the ground that are kind of lighting up even while the fire is way over here. So it really gave a sense of extra realism to the look. Even though it's not 100% realistic, but you want it to kind of evoke a real world, evoke something that feels like it's consistent. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to the next project, and in the last little bit here, I'm going to show you how I went through setting this up. So basically, I had to go through and plan out how I was going to have this reveal the logo. So you can see this comp here. This has all my layers, and here are the shots. So the cameras are moving, okay, and this is all, I rendered this in advance so that it wouldn't drag too much. But here you can see I've added more contact, some more contact lighting. In this particular render, the lighting on the ground is a little bit more defined, so it almost looks like there's a reflectivity or something happening. I've got lots of sparks. Particular is particularly good at sparks. Okay, so that wasn't too hard. And what I used for the emitter, instead of using that null object, I used lights. And the cool thing about using After Effects lights as your emitter, you see there's all these lights here, is that I can have more than one. So rather than having one particle layer that looks at one light, or looks at one null, I can have a lot of lights that are all called emitter in the beginning. And what this allows me to do is to paint with more than one brush at one time. So you get this cool look where the fire is just kind of traveling. I've got it looks like I got 4 different streams that are happening in this particular shot. Okay, and then another angle. And what having it all in one comp allowed me to do was to use the same elements and then just switch the camera angles. This is not always possible. It's not always, it doesn't always work, especially as you scale the scope of your project, but you can see that's a lot of layers going on there. I do love my layers, I have been told, but here's the end result. And you can even see that fire is ending at the top of the logo. And there we go. Okay, so by the way, I wanted this kind of gobo effect where you've got the shadows happening, and you've got that going on, I think it's first shot. So you can see on the floor, you can kind of see that there's this light moving on the floor. And to achieve that, it was pretty simple. I created this, right? This is just kind of like a piece of geometry. I used Element 3D, and I just kind of rotated this around, similar to like if it was a real gobo, that's just kind of twisting and turning. And what this made it seem like the light is moving. So it creates this illusion where the shadows are moving because you're changing the light, which in reality, it's just this gobo. And I think that actually might have been the shadow cast by the gobo. Anyway, so I put that on the floor, Okay, just flat down on the floor. And now what this allows me to do is not have to render crazy shadows in After Effects every single time, right? So because I pre-rendered this and then brought it back in as an element, it renders a lot faster and allows me that, to still have that cool look. Okay. So I'm going to go to my top view here and just kind of give you a sense of how I went through this. So I've got my lights. There's my camera. You can see the cameras are changing. I got different cameras going. Okay. And then I've got all these emitters. So look, this is one of the emitters. It's tracing the logo like that. There we go. And then I've got another one. And eventually I turn these off because ultimately I don't need anything that the light is casting. I just need the data for particular. So if you go in here, you can, let's see if I select these lights, you should be able to see them. Let's see here. Yeah, so you can see this light. There it is. Boom. This is basically what's drawing out the fire. And then you can see these other lights here. Now there are more than one for each stream because I had a separate one for the sparks. It just kind of worked out that way, where I found that the original light was basically flat on the ground, but I needed the sparks to kind of start a little bit above the ground. So that's all that was. So eventually I got into, we released this video and I showed it to you, the final product. But at the end of the year, the National Bible Bee has a competition. And for the competition, we had a 5-minute countdown video that we needed. So basically, we liked this idea. So the question that kind of complicated things was, how do I take this 30-second, really the fire is like 15 seconds of it, and the rest is text, right? How do I take that and make 5 minutes of it and use the same logo? So we got to slow things down, right? But here was my other problem. Right here in the comp, it seems really speedy because I pre-rendered it. But this was sluggish. This stuff was taking a long time to render, and I would render overnight, that sort of thing. So for 15 seconds of fire footage, it was going to be extrapolated over to 5 minutes. It was going to take forever, and this just becomes unworkable. I can't really do that. This is going to be too much work for really the system to be rendering, and it's going to just slow me down a ton. And so now I start to think of ways that I can simplify while scaling up the detail. So it's like I don't need less detail. I need more detail, and I need it to be faster. So it's really it was an interesting challenge. So I start to think of what are the areas in this scene that are really heavy, that are taking up a lot. Now the technique I started showing you, I was using a texture on the ground, but in this original one, I was using a texture, but it was rendered with the plugin Element 3D. So it is actually a piece of 3D geometry that the texture was mapped onto. And I wonder if there is a shot in here that kind of shows it. Yeah, so you can see in the far distance there, basically the texture, it basically bends upward. That's what's basically happening here. And this is an Element 3D layer. So as I needed to duplicate the layer to add lighting to the ground with my fire particles, it started to really bog down the system. And again, for 15 seconds, not too bad, but if I am extrapolating this effect over much longer, it's going to be more difficult. So I'm going to hop over to my countdown project. So one of the things that I decided to do was really go even closer to the texture. I want to go closer and use more of more detail on this logo. So having a tileable floor texture really helped because I could basically just grab that. I could create kind of a tile, say like of 9 textures. Each one I think was 5,000 pixels wide and 5,000 pixels tall. And so I could create a grid of that and then lay that down on the ground, so I have a pretty good bit of texture. If I were to try to take one 5,000 pixel wide and tall image and tile it with a tile effect, After Effects would break basically immediately. So that's why I need to use a grid of images that render separately, so After Effects isn't trying to calculate one massive texture. This is why it helps to have tiles. Okay, so I start to think about how to lay out 5 minutes of this thing, and here's the grid. Call it the grid. Just put all close on the panels. There we go. Okay, so each of those little squares is 5,000 pixels. Okay, it's a big, but what that allows me to do is get super duper close. So what I did was I took this logo and I made squares, individual squares of the logo. Okay, so that's one square, and this is at 25%, right? So this is how close I can get to the logo. And as you can see, I did some texture work where the logo's it looks kind of like it's burned into the ground or painted into the ground, but this allowed me to get some cool detail. So if I take this and I lay it down on the ground, I'm going to be able to get pretty close with the camera. I can use some cool depth of field, and I'm able to get a better effect. And yeah, it might take 5 minutes to get through the whole logo if you're running at that level of detail. So here's what I got going for these. Looks like I got one camera on there. So let's take a look. I would basically lay this out and then put a camera in there and see how close I can get to it and see what that looks like. Okay, so I'm able to rotate pretty close to this texture, and I'm still maintaining a lot of this quality. You're seeing some of this depth of field happening. I think I got that turned on. So if we turned that up even more, you can see, this is starting to look, it's like a lot of detail. And what you'll notice is it doesn't take too long to render either, because these are not Element 3D geometry layers. These are just basic textures. Okay, so you'll see we're seeing through this layer right here. The way to fix something like that would be to have a layer below it. So, pop, goes away. Okay, let's see. That crease too is two different layers, right? Because I have a tile. So that's just two different layers right next to each other. Okay, so the setup. This is basically what my animation comp setup looked like. I tried to kind of create a lot of it in as few comps as possible, and then duplicate whatever layers I needed. Once I got a good look, I would duplicate this and put it into my individual shots. So you can see I'm starting out here. I've got one camera. That little square that's moving along with the little particle line, that's the focus distance, okay? So I'm going forward in time, and look at this camera. These are different cameras, and you can see my camera rigs that I've set up. Here we go. And we're seeing more and more, and this is basically just over time, this fire is tracing out this logo. And this particular comp, we're just going up one side of the logo, but this takes me to about 1 minute and 15 seconds. So we're in good shape for 5 minutes, right? Because this is going to take a while. And by the way, in this particular case, I didn't really need to reveal the logo until the very end. So I can make things pretty abstract, but I still wanted to use the contours of the shape of this logo to have this fire. I used a particle generator here, similar to what I did before, but this one is a low-res preview, so that I could really nail my camera moves and really get a sense for time. This is really the second step, is really laying out how these camera moves are going to go. You see those dots, it's not going to look like that in the final, but I can get a sense for how these camera moves are going to flow. I get a sense for, it's basically like an animatic. And so the fire's going to be going along this way. Okay, I might have a verse. I was going to put verses down on the ground because the Bible competition. So we're going to have that. And this is basically how I laid it out. So I had a couple compositions that were similar to this. And I basically would take the relevant layers. So in this particular shot, I don't need the entire tapestry. I don't need the entire, all the lights that are generating all these layers. So I'm going to basically just copy the layers that I need. So I would go through, select layers in the composition that were relevant. And you can see a lot of these layers aren't even on at this point in the composition. So I don't really need those. I mostly just need whatever layers are visible with this particular camera, and it basically ends, 8 seconds in or so. So that's what I did. I replicated that across like 40 shots. And this created a workflow that was much faster than my original workflow, which meant that I could turn out these shots a lot quicker. So here's how one of the shots is turning out. You can see things kind of changed up a little bit from the original, where I've got this detail. Look at the ground. It's got that high-res detail, and this fire's coming in. It's so much slower, right? But then it reveals, basically, it lights up the words on the ground. And this is one of the things that I was talking about before. Look at the bright areas that are sort of lighting up before the fire gets there. You're seeing some of this, well, you can't see very well, some of this detail that's kind of lighting up. It makes it look like this thing has a bump map or as a normals mat or something. It kind of gives it some detail, but that I don't have to render all that because it's just a layer with a crushed, luminance. So I really am able to work much faster. I'll just go to one more shot here. Let's see here. Turn this on. Okay, so here's two streams. Again, I'm so close, so I can use a lot of depth of field and really kind of get a sense. I was thinking it's like a main on end title sequence. It's like a, like a show open sequence like they do these days. And so you can see over time the fire's kind of dying down, it's scaling down, but really it's because it's moving so much we get that illusion that the fire is maybe just dying down. I got some sparks. I'm not going crazy with the sparks. But that's basically what I did. It was 5 minutes of doing that. And let's see. Here's a simple breakdown of basically the layers that are going into this. Okay, so I got my fire, got my sparks, got some smoke, got some lighting on the ground. Whoop. What's happening? Is it gonna see if it'll keep rendering. Okay, sparks, smoke, lighting, more lighting, and then I've got my stroke on the ground, depth of field, and then a bunch of glow and stuff. So you'll notice between this frame and this frame, there's quite a difference, right? These are the sorts of finishing effects that really help to kind of glue the final product together. Here, it's looking a little funky. The lighting is the fire's kind of blown out a little bit, but in a not really great way. This really helps to give some, to just make it look like it all belongs a little bit more. Okay, so I use pretty simple techniques to achieve a lot of that. Simple fast blurs and glows. I wonder if I could take one of these shots here and let's see. Well, what I'll do is I'll show you. Okay. Basically, the first, a first layer might have a curves adjustment where I crush it down to the highlights, and then I use a couple effects to basically put the layer back on and blur that again. It sounds a little complicated, but it's not too bad. So basically, I'll crush the highlights. I'll add a fast blur. I'll add the original back on, but I'll set that to a screen mode, and then I'll add another fast blur, and then I'll crush that again, and then I'll color correct. And then I'll add that as a screen over top. So what you get is just a little bit more interesting look. And I do that basically to create this kind of more progressive glow. There are plugins you can use, like Red Giant has one, I think that's called Deep Glow or something like that. So those glows try to mimic a more real world glow. I'm doing this more than just the After Effects only way, which is to create, basically isolate highlights and then create blurs to create some of these progressive glows. And then on top of that, I have some sharpening. Actually, using sharpen on top of a render like this really helps. I actually heard that in a podcast recently, and I was happy because I was like, oh, I'm doing that. I got some lens distortion. It's very light. You can kind of see on these edges. And then I put some grain. Grain really helps to tie things together. It's going to be really hard to see it up there. Well, no, you can see it. See that? Okay. Not footage. It just helps it feel a little bit more realistic. By the way, this took me so many years to figure out, but if you're dealing with banding, if you've ever had glows or you're working with blurred layers on a black background in After Effects and you notice that there are these bands running around your glow and it's not looking that great, and you're killing yourself trying to figure out what it is, first, make sure that your project is set to at least 16 bits per channel. But the second thing you want to do is add grain. Grain really helps to tell After Effects this is one continuous image and there aren't so many color ramp boundaries. That really has helped. All right, so check out these render times. So as I was preparing for this, I was exporting stills for the breakdown, and breakdown for that original logo, you're seeing the very first frame. This is how long it's taking to render, okay? 1 minute and 30 seconds. Over the course of 5 minutes is going to be a lot. Over the course of 15 minutes, typically After Effects, I've noticed once it gets past that first frame, it renders a little quicker, but that's just a lot. So the final frame there is rendering at about 1 minute and 30 seconds, but compare that to paring down this project a little bit, adding the detail, but breaking it up. And look how fast my comps are rendering now. It's like 17 seconds. It's not too bad. This is doable for a much longer program. And these are just simple things, like I'm thinking about how my project is put together. What are the elements and how could I simplify those elements while maintaining high quality? The final product for that 5-minute countdown, I'll just show you a little bit of it. Here it is. All right, so you can see how basically this works. It's a procedural effect. These are things that I can basically set up, and even though there is some customization that's happening per shot, it's really not that much. So I'm able to replicate this effect, and because it's not much changing, these are just the fires going across the screen, I'm able to do this fairly quickly. And you can see my camera moves. I'm using that camera rig that I talked about. I'll even go more complicated in some cases, depending on the flexibility I need. This one's kind of pushing in more. And then we've got this one. These are some of my favorite ones because the fire comes from, that shallow, far depth of field and then comes into focus. And so you're seeing some of that floor. So you can see some of the detail already happening here. And then more of the full lighting comes. We've got this text that's being lit up on the ground. And it's basically dark, so you need that lighting. The only way we're going to see it is if that lighting works. So we get that lighting in there. And this is basically how it is. And then I ended the sequence with, I'm not 100% happy with the very end because I basically ran out of time. but more or less this is how we end. We're finishing it out. And then, as you can see, I was just like, I can't do fire for the very end. I'm gonna get some glows in there. I'm gonna use some masking. And there we go. Okay. This is actually my least favorite part of the whole thing because because it's a lot more quick. It's not really using the fire. So let's go back to the fire. Okay. All right, so that's how I lay out a project. That's my thought process. That's how I plan it out. What are your questions? Yes. How did I get the drawing into the software? That's a great question. This was an Adobe Illustrator file. Right here. I can import that directly into After Effects. After Effects and Adobe and Illustrator are the same company, and they talk very well to each other. So all I have to do is basically double-click in the project window, and I can find that layer and import it. So here we go. Actually, a better way would be to, so that's DJ, okay, DJ21, do that. So I'm going to take that layer, and I'm going to import it as a composition. Okay, layer size. There we go. So now I've got all these layers inside, see? So this is all ready to go. I can start texturing, I can start duplicating some of this stuff, and that's how I import into After Effects. Other questions? Yes?
About the extensions, where can you find those? How can you add them in?
Absolutely. So plugins for After Effects are pretty easy to install. Typically when you get the plugin, it'll have a README or something like that where it basically will tell you which folder to put it in. So you basically want to put it in your application folder. Some plugins will come with their own installation, so you can just basically double click and install like you would a normal app on your computer. At the very last page, on the very last page of the handout, you'll see a URL for my website. That is davidjbeal.com/resources. So it looks like it says David I. Beal almost, but that's davidjbeal.com/resources. I put some of my favorite plugins on there with links to where you can get them. Other questions? Yes? That's a good question. How long did this take me start to finish for the whole project? So the first one, the 30-second ad, took me, I would say, I'm guessing about, I did not log my time for this one, which I should have, but I'm guessing it probably took me about 40 hours or so. Yeah. For the longer version, it actually was probably similar. Just because I had a workflow going, I didn't have to start from the ground up. Yeah, so it was about 40 hours. A lot of my projects will be, say if I'm animating an explainer video or something like that, it might take about 80 hours to create the material and animate it. It could be anywhere from 80 to 100, 120. Those are sort of the clockings that I've gotten. Other questions? Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, when I'm approaching a project, how much do I use old assets or assets from elsewhere, stock assets, things like that, and how much do I sort of create from scratch, right? So it really does depend. If I need spark footage, if I need fire footage, I've never gone out and shot this stuff myself. There are some pretty good stock packs that I have access to. Like the one I used for this one, again, is videocopilot.com. It was a collection called Action Essentials 2. And typically that's been enough for some of this sort of thing. When it comes to explainer videos, vector art stuff, it really depends. I might get the stuff from an Illustrator. So in that case, obviously, I have my assets. In this particular case, I had a logo already. But I'll often create my own assets and break open Illustrator and make style frames and storyboards with just creating stuff from scratch. Since I don't have a really good handle on drawing, I'll often use a lot of reference material. I might even trace some, if I need to build a desk, I might find a picture of a real desk or even somebody else's artwork, and I might kind of just use that as a reference and stuff like that. For some projects, I might have access to a Shutterstock subscription, and I might pull down some art from there and use that as well. Any other questions? Hi. Yes.
When it comes to like VFX, I don't know how much you know about it. Is that usually easier than for something like this, since you're showing footage with like somebody in the real world and VFX over that?
It really depends on what you're trying to do. The question is are visual effects easier than doing something like this, where you're sort of creating elements from scratch? It really depends. A lot of visual effects in my world has been a lot of work. Visual effects can be a lot because and this is an entirely virtual world. So I don't have to match it to real footage. I'm just creating it from scratch. So I would say that typically visual effects are going to be more difficult in the sense that you have to make it essentially invisible or at least realistic, that this was actually shot. Let me see, I can show you some visual effects in this particular. Anybody here seeing the movie Beyond the Mask? Came out a number of years ago. Okay, so I was tasked with working on this sequence. There's this electricity sequence here. Lots of sparks, lots of electricity. There we go. So all of this stuff was basically done in post. We got the reflections on those conductors and stuff. This is one of my favorite shots with the light. Rotoscoped that wheel on the upper corner there to simulate, this light coming through, all kinds of sparks. If anybody here work on Beyond the Mask? Okay, there was a ton of rotoscoping. I want to say I rotoscoped this project, this particular shot, but I don't quite remember. But you can see all that electricity and stuff happening. These are the sorts of visual effects that are easier to do, in my opinion, because who goes out to look at electricity every day? It's just like there's a lot of creative freedom. This is probably the funnest visual effects project that I worked on. And it had its own challenges, but I would say that a lot of what the other artists had to do in creating photoreal stuff was probably even more difficult. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming, and hope that you have enjoyed After Effects and are looking forward to breaking open your own projects.